Here I have 26 different quotations that I think are really important for us to think about when we think about Mr Birling in J.B. Priestley's And Inspector Calls. But which 10 do I think are the most important? Let's find out. Hey everyone, it's me, Liam, aka Mr Knight, aka DystopiaJunkie, and if you're watching this video, then it's because you're looking for some quotations for the character Mr Birling in J.B. Priestley's play An Inspector Calls. Well, congrats to you, because in this video I am going to give you 10, that's right, a whopping 10 quotations for the character. And I've even made sure that they span the whole play. Alongside each quotation, I will be doing some spoken analysis, so you might find it useful to grab a pen and paper. Before the quotations, I will quickly summarise the character, and after them, I will also think a little about Priestley's intentions for making the character exactly the way that they are. So make sure you stick around for the whole video. And of course, if as you're watching this video, you think that it is super helpful and that you would like some more content like this, you can let me know by dropping the video a like, commenting on it, and of course subscribing to my channel. I've recently hit 400 subs, and so I guess the race is on to hit 500. So here is my quick summary of Mr Birling. His first name is Arthur, and so you might hear me call him Arthur Birling or Mr Birling throughout this video. Those are all interchangeable terms. He is the head of the Birling family. In 1912, which is when this play is set, families were very patriarchal, and so the dads, they were in charge. Mr Birling owns a business, although curiously, we never find out what it is that his business makes or does. This vagueness helps him to represent all pre-World War I business owners. He is also a character who displays capitalist views throughout the play. Arthur might be a self-made man. As I mentioned in my context video, which if you haven't seen that, a link for it is appearing on screen about now, he hasn't necessarily always belonged in the top end of the middle class, which we can see by a number of things, including his slip-ups when it comes to etiquette. Mr Birling enjoys power, status and authority. He mentions being the Lord Mayor of Brumley, which is an elected role, a few times in the play. He gets excited about the idea of receiving a knighthood, and he drinks the same port that Gerald's upper-class father drinks, and so on. On the flip side, Arthur does not like it when his power, status or authority are challenged, and we'll see this in just a little bit. And importantly, his role in Eva Smith's suicide is that he sacked her from her job at his factory because she went on strike. You could, I guess, argue that he raised Sheila and Eric in certain ways as well, and that meant that their poor behaviour also could reflect on him. So with all of that out of the way, let's look at some quotations. So here we have the first quotation. It says, Arthur Birling is a heavy-looking, rather portentous man in his middle 50s, with fairly easy manners, but rather provincial in speech. Now this quotation comes from the play's opening stage directions. Remember that you can analyse stage directions when talking about a play, and that the phrase stage directions also counts as subject terminology. This sentence suggests many things about Mr Birling. Heavy looking probably refers to his weight and general bulk, suggesting that he lives a life of relative luxury and excess, whilst also suggesting that he is relatively inactive. He instead sits and bosses people around rather than doing much labour-intensive work himself. Rather portentous suggests that he is a bit pompous, meaning that everything he does is overly grand and showy, indicating to us as readers from the very start that he may be a bit arrogant. Easy in manners shows that he is somewhat relaxed in this company, by which I mean the family that he is in charge of, which is important to note, given how he behaves once the inspector is around. Finally, rather provincial in speech suggests that Arthur Birling is not naturally middle class, and that he has come from a more humble background, given that provincial can mean small town or rural. Here is our second quotation. Mr Birling says, "Perhaps we may look forward to the time when Crofts and Birlings are no longer competing, but are working together for lower costs and higher prices." This is part of the speech he delivers when he gives a toast at the end of the celebratory dinner. This presents Arthur as business-minded, as one of the key reasons for him being happy about his daughter's engagement is not her happiness, but because of what her engagement means for his business. It seems that the Crofts' business is a rival to Mr Birling's business, and I imagine that it is much bigger too, given the higher status of Gerald's parents. This exemplifies his capitalist mindset, as he is more concerned about money than people. And for our third quotation, we have, "And I'm talking as a hard-headed practical man of business." This also comes from his end of dinner speech. I've included this quotation for a few different reasons. Firstly, I feel that hard-headed practical man of business is a nice short quotation to remember. Secondly, it shows us what Mr Birling really thinks about himself. In his own eyes, his identity is rooted in his career. He is a man of business. Added to this, though, we have hard-headed, which can mean not sentimental, suggesting that he doesn't care about who he has to step on in order to get what he wants. Practical also makes him seem more of a doer than a thinker. Maybe he sees himself as somebody who makes quick decisions, which he apparently views as a good thing, rather than somebody who might sit there and think deeply. Now, by describing himself in terms that he sees as positive, we could call Mr Birling arrogant or egotistical. In less exam-friendly speech, he's full of himself. However, we could also say that through describing himself as this, he is inadvertently embracing his negatives. By being a hard-headed practical man of business, he is an uncaring, thoughtless, money-grabbing fool. To be honest with you, this quotation comes from a much larger speech, which is so useful. Birling says an awful lot between pages 6 and 7, including his famous Titanic quotation. I intend on covering that speech in a separate video. Quotation number 4 comes from when the inspector first starts to question Mr Birling. Mr Birling says, somewhat impatiently, "Look, there's nothing mysterious or scandalous about this business. At least, not so far as I'm concerned." Now, rather than thinking about the language here, although you could say something about the adjective scandalous for sure, I want to instead look at the stage directions
and the punctuation,
which is also a useful thing to analyse in certain situations. Firstly, the stage directions. Mr Birling says these lines somewhat impatiently. This suggests that he is losing his patience with the inspector because he is not used to and does not like being the less powerful person in a relationship. Secondly, the punctuation. There are 4 dashes in this quotation. Dashes can show when somebody's thoughts are not totally clear in their own mind, and so they pause frequently and possibly change their line of argument somewhat. These dashes show Mr Birling to be under pressure, on the back foot, and not totally confident of himself. And our 5th quotation comes a little bit later, once the inspector has made it clear that he wants to question other members of the Birling family, and not just Arthur. Upon realising this, Mr Birling says, with a marked change of tone, Well, of course. If I'd known that earlier, I wouldn't have called you officious and talked about reporting you. You understand that, don't you, Inspector? The stage directions make it explicit that Mr Birling must speak these lines with a marked change of tone, which just means noticeably different to how he spoke before. Before, he was speaking angrily and abruptly, and those two words are direct quotations. So we can assume that he is now speaking in a way that is more calm, polite, and measured. What's caused this change, though? Well, it seems that Mr Birling is no longer being scrutinised. He is no longer being put under pressure, which makes him feel better. This positive feeling has come despite the fact that it is his family, his children, or potentially his wife, who will be interrogated instead. This shows him to be selfish, self-preserving, and a bit careless. The incredible politeness of this quotation, which we can see maybe in the final question, is also interesting. It is almost as if Mr Birling is now flattering the inspector, or is being obedient, showing that, consciously or not, he knows who has more power in their relationship. Our sixth quotation comes much later on in the play, and is actually not from Mr Birling himself. Remember that the things characters say about each other or to each other can also be very revealing. Here we have Eric talking to his father once it has come out that Eric stole money in order to support Eva/Daisy and their unborn child. When Mr Birling asks Eric why he didn't go to him for support, Eric replies with, "Because you're not the kind of father a chap can go to when he's in trouble, that's why." Immediately, this presents Mr Birling as a poor parent, as his son does not see him as the kind of father a chap could go to when he's in trouble. This suggests that Mr Birling has always been a relatively unsupportive father. He may have supported Eric financially and enabled him to live a good lifestyle, but his parenting has not been supportive in an emotional sense. Furthermore, because Mr Birling has to ask Eric why he didn't go to him for help, essentially showing that Mr Birling does not know or believe himself to not be the kind of father a chap could go to when he's in trouble, Mr Birling could also be seen as a little deluded. He thinks that he is a good parent and assumes that his parental authority must be respected. Our seventh quotation comes a little later, just before the inspector's final speech. As the inspector reminds each character of the parts they played in Eva/Daisy's death, Mr Birling says, unhappily, "Look, Inspector, I'd give thousands, yes, thousands." Just like our fourth quotation, we could pick up on the stage directions and the use of dashes in Arthur's lines. The dashes show him to be on the back foot, whereas the stage directions make his emotions clear. He is unhappy. This unhappiness, combined with his dialogue, where he expresses that he would give thousands, suggests something positive about Mr Birling. He may be starting to see the errors of his ways. When reminded that Eva/Daisy is dead, he is sad and says that he would have given her a pay rise now instead. Maybe his capitalist views are starting to mellow, and this is perhaps the most caring we ever see him be towards a member of the working class. Of course, this has come all too late, showing that Mr Birling is a bit thick-skulled. He does not learn quickly, and nor does he change his mind all that easily. However, the mellowing of Mr Birling's capitalist views does not last that long. The inspector leaves, and Mr Birling immediately turns on his son, saying sternly, "It doesn't matter to you. Apparently nothing matters to you. But it may interest you to know that until every penny of that money you stole is repaid, you will work for nothing." Priestley's choice of stage directions and language here present Mr Birling as harsh and money obsessed. His main concerns regarding his son are not to do with his emotional state, his apparent alcoholism, the fact that his unborn child has been lost, or even the fact that he was just intensely interrogated by the inspector. Instead, Mr Birling's concerns are financially based. Instead of consoling his son about any of those things I just mentioned, he instead focuses on the fact that Eric stole money. Birling prioritises finances over people time and time again in this play. And although our previous quotation suggested that he was starting to change, we can see that almost as quickly as the inspector leaves, Mr Birling forgets any lessons that he may have learned. And here is our penultimate quotation for Mr Birling, which comes once they have found out that Inspector Gould was a fraud, and that Eva/Daisy
were multiple people,
and that she may not have even died. He says, imitating the inspector in his final speech, "You all helped kill her." He points at Sheila and Eric and laughs. And I wish you could have seen the look on your faces when he said that. Simply put, this quotation shows Mr Birling to be rude and cruel. Through imitating the inspector, the character who, we should remember, clearly demonstrated power over Mr Birling throughout the play, Mr Birling is mocking him, clearly highlighting anti-socialist views. Mr Birling has not learned a thing from the inspector and has quickly forgotten how much power he exerted over him. Secondly, this quotation presents Mr Birling as cruel. His children are still emotionally stunned by the inspector's words, and rather than look after his children and make sure that they are okay, he makes them relive this possibly traumatic experience. And he laughs at them. Their emotional discomfort pleases Mr Birling. His capitalist views don't just make him somebody who doesn't care about the poor, but apparently also about his own family. And here we have our final quotation for Mr Birling, which comes on the final page of the play. He says, pointing to Eric and Sheila, "Now look at the pair of them, the famous younger generation who know it all, and they can't even take a joke." This quotation reinforces what I said about the last quotation. Mr Birling is cruel, as he is openly mocking his children again, who are still emotionally stunned. These last two quotations have come in quick succession and will give the audience a lasting impression of Mr Birling, since they come at the very end of the play. As a representative of the older, politically capitalist generation, Priestley may have been trying to emphasise the negative qualities that he saw in them. It was their inability to care for their fellow man that may have inevitably led to fire and blood and anguish. So, it's all well and good being able to remember lots of quotations about a character. And of course, it is even better if you are also able to analyse them. However, in order to get into the top grades, you need to start to bring in the author's possible intentions when analysing a character. After all, Mr Birling is just a textual construct, and in the first instance, he only existed as a collection of words on a bunch of pages. He's not a real person. So we need to think about Priestley's intentions. Why did Priestley make Mr Birling the way he is? Well, first of all, Mr Birling can be seen as a representation of power in 1912. He is a wealthy male homeowner, which means that out of all of the characters in the play, he is the only one we know for sure who would have been able to vote, since we don't know enough about Gerald or the inspector. I think it's also safe for me to say that Mr Birling is not exactly presented very positively in this play. And so if we bring those two ideas together, we get the impression that Priestley wanted to present the people who had power in 1912 in a negative way, as it was them who led the world to its First and later Second World Wars. Mr Birling can also be seen as the personification of capitalist views. He is a business owner who seemingly cares more about money than people, as that extends even to his own family. As I just mentioned, Mr Birling has been presented in a pretty negative light throughout this play, and so it can be said that J.B. Priestley may have been rejecting capitalist views by writing this play. And finally, in a similar light once again, Priestley may have written Mr Birling in the way that he has done in order to deride anti-socialist views. Throughout the play, Mr Birling openly rejects and mocks socialist views, the idea of being responsible for each other, looking out for one another, and so on. And yet, he is also presented negatively in this play. He is certainly not a character who the audience are supposed to side with or support. This negative presentation of anti-socialist views is Priestley's way of deriding them, or, if you prefer, it is Priestley's way of championing socialist views. So there we go, those are the 10 quotations that I've selected for Mr Birling. If you found this video useful or interesting, please do let me know by dropping it a like and a comment as well. Why not throw in a comment to let me know either how much it helped you with your revision, or maybe asking me any questions you might have about Mr Birling, or even throwing in a different quotation that you think is most useful to know when thinking about Mr Birling. Of course, subscribing to my channel is also something that I would really appreciate, because that is going to help me reach even more young people and help them with their revision too. As ever, I hope you have an awesome rest of the day, and if you are revising, please remember to take frequent short breaks. Cheers.